Brothers and sisters, I think it is important for us Christians to always be asking ourselves the question, what do we want of and from God? Are we just seeking a God who can fulfill our worldly wants and desires, to help us get a good job, to help pay the bills, to help the children get better when they're sick? Is God for us just like another arm of government that provides for our various needs when we can't provide enough for ourselves? Obviously, we hope not, but it is an ever-present danger, for as long as we have a loving God who wants to provide for all of our needs, we're always in danger of treating God like a vending machine. We see this attitude play out in the first reading when the Israelites ask Moses and Aaron, "Why did we not die at the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we were able to sit down to pans of meat and could eat bread to our heart's content?" Even though they spoke like this, how did the loving God of Israel respond to Moses? He said, "I've heard the complaints of the sons of Israel. Say this to them, between the 2 evenings you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have bread to your heart's content. Then you will learn that I, the Lord, am your God." So even though the people literally threw mud in God's face because they were no longer getting all the food selection they once had in Egypt, God still provided for them. Last Sunday, brothers and sisters, in the first week of the 5-week Bread of Life discourse from John's Gospel, Jesus addressed the needs of the bodies of all the people who were following him and listening to him. As a loving God, he couldn't help but help those whom he created and loved, even those who would one day reject him. They were sick and they were hungry, so he healed them and he fed them. After the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus went up the mountain to pray, and the apostles got on their boats, where suddenly they faced a storm. Jesus appeared to them on the water, and then, just as suddenly, they made landfall on the other side of the lake. Jesus, in this small intervening event in the Bread of Life discourse, revealed to the apostles his divine power over nature, just before he was going to hit them with one of the biggest tenets of the Christian faith, the miracle of the Eucharist, an even more stupendous example of God's exercising of his power over the laws of nature. But before Jesus was to reveal this most stupendous miracle, which we will hear more about in the coming 2 Sundays, he first had to slowly move them from focusing on the bodily to focusing on the spiritual, from a feeding of their bodies to a feeding of their souls. He warns them, as he warns us, against simply working or looking for corporal food that does not last. But instead we all need to work for food that endures to eternal life, the kind of food the Son of Man is offering. God the Father and Jesus, while they continually care for and provide for our physical bodies, they ultimately seek to lead us to a focus on the spiritual, from the things that pass away to the things that are eternal. Jesus tells the people, as he tells us today, that the true bread is the bread of God, that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. The life he is speaking of does, of course, have a corporal component, but more importantly, it also has a spiritual component. In finishing, Jesus said, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never be hungry. He who believes in me will never thirst." Brothers and sisters, is Jesus speaking of physical hunger and thirst? No, I don't think so. He's speaking of spiritual hunger and thirst, a hunger that can only be satisfied through a relationship with Jesus, and a thirst that can only be quenched by faith and trust in Jesus. It is significant to note that at this point in time, Jesus has not yet said anything about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. These words we will hear in the next 2 weeks. If Jesus had ended the Bread of Life discourse at this point in time, the average person could comfortably conclude that Jesus was simply speaking metaphorically when he said he's the bread of life, in the same way that he said, "I am the vine and you are the branches." He would simply be saying that his words and his actions and his example would be the spiritual food on which we would have a good life. We will see in the next 2 weeks, though, that there is much more to the story, as Jesus moves us from bodily focus to spiritual focus to a great test of our faith and trust in a stupendous miracle over the laws of nature. the greatest gift that God could give us, the gift of his Son, his body, blood, soul, and divinity, hidden in bread and wine, as both physical and spiritual food. Let us keep our hearts and minds open as we progress in the coming Sundays through this beautiful Bread of Life discourse.